Hey guys, how's it going? It's been a week since Voldex has released Abyssal Void to Dungeon Quest, and after playing it a bunch, I thought I'd give you guys my opinion on whether it is a good dungeon or not. Now, just like all the other Voldex updates for Dungeon Quest, this is a very controversial one on whether it's a good update or not, but this video will just be my opinion on what I think of the dungeon overall, as well as the event, and basically all the items that you can get and their looks. Now, if you guys like this video, please drop a like and subscribe to the channel for more future gaming content. Now, let's get into it. So similar to my Yokai Peak review, I'm going to be splitting this video up into sections. So first, I'm going to cover the map design as well as the theming for the dungeon. Next, I'm going to be covering the items and all their designs for this dungeon. And lastly, I will be talking about the balancing for this dungeon and whether it is good or not. I'm sure throughout this review, there's going to be a lot of hot takes for this dungeon because it is, again, very controversial between whether it's good or not. A few people like it, while some people don't. But again, this is all just my opinion, so you're free to disagree and post it in the comments on what you disagree on. Now let's get started with the map design. Now starting off with the map design, I actually kind of like the map of Abyssal Void. Similar to Yokai Peak, it has a very interesting layout for its path compared to all of VCaFe's dungeons before Gilded Skies. The general color of the dungeon I also think is pretty nice, although it is quite overused as a void dungeon. It's still quite nice that the whole dungeon has a purple atmosphere. It's kind of a Gilded Skies aspect with the floating islands and stuff. I think those are all pretty nice. Now, the thing that bugs me about Abyssal Void is the spawning area and just the first two rooms there. The spawning area, it really resembled Enchanted Forest with all the mushrooms and even the things hanging on the ceiling. Those were all taken from Enchanted Forest, which I can't really say is lazy or not, but it's just something that bugged me about the dungeon. Another thing about Abyssal Void that bugs me is the invisible barriers and some areas that are lacking them. You guys might have known in the area after the first boss, there are a few platforms that you have to jump on and then jump onto the stage that contains all the enemies. Well, there are no invisible barriers on the platform, so it is possible to completely fall out of the world and just die. Now, it is something new for Dungeon Quest, I will say that, but there at least should have been a barrier that prevents enemies from falling out of the world, because if you guys have played Abyssal Void enough, you'll probably know that the void shades like to teleport to players outside of the map and either fall out of the world or get stuck there indefinitely. Now, this is something that Voldex will really need to patch because the void shades are really annoying on their own with their shield gaining abilities whenever they hit someone. However, it seems there is something else about this dungeon, and you probably have seen it from my live stream of Abyssal Void, but the enemies like to become immune to damage if you try to cheese them. Now, I understand the logic behind this, but it also poses a problem when it comes to the Void Shades specifically, because the Void Shades, like I mentioned, like to teleport to players that are way outside the arena, so they become completely immune to damage. So other than those problems, I think it is a really good map. Compared to Yokai Peak, I think the Void version of Gilded Skies is a lot more appealing than the Yokai theme in my opinion. Of course, the things that would have needed to be toned down for the dungeon design is less purple. There is a lot of purple in this dungeon, but it didn't bother me at least. So my overall rating of the map is a 9 out of 10. It is a really good map with an interesting layout. However, if they added some invisible barriers for the enemies and made invisible barriers on some areas less strict, then it would have been a really good map. Now, next up, we have the design of the items, and this is going to be a bit of a spicy one. Let's start with the weapons. So after seeing the concept of all the weapons, I think the weapons could have looked really good. However, the insane weapons, what really bugs me about them is their size. Their size is way smaller than the Yokai Peak weapons, which was really bothering for me. Especially with VCaFe's dungeons after Enchanted Forest. The insane weapons were about the same size as the nightmare weapons, which I thought were nice. However, the general designs of the insane weapons, they were actually decent enough, but it's just their size that was really putting me off. Similar to Yokai Peak weapons, they were just too small. Now the Nightmare weapons is where it starts to get a little bit better. The size of the weapons was toned up a lot from Yokai Peak, so it's about the same size as the Gilded Skies weapons, if not as big as the Northern Lands weapons, which we know were really big. Even the Legendary and the Ultimates were really big. Like, it is a nice change that they were so big. However, there is a little bit of a problem with it. Now this may be a hot take, but I really don't like the designs of the Ultimates. The Mage Ultimate is very closely designed to the tier 3 weapon from Gilded Skies Nightmare, which is the Oathsworn Staff and Tomb. The Warrior Ultimate is also extremely close to the Gilded Skies Ultimate we got basically a few months after Gilded Skies release and before VCAFE handed off the reins. So I felt it was a little bit lazy for the Warrior Ultimate, and even then, I still don't think it looks that good, because seeing its design in game, it is basically a giant purple Christmas tree, if you get what I mean. You guys might disagree with me on this, but if you compare the Warrior Ultimate with the Christmas tree cosmetic from either Christmas 2022 or Christmas 2023, you can actually see a very similar resemblance in just their general shape. You can see the base of the sword on the lance on the Warrior Ultimate is very similar to the base of a tree from the cosmetic. So that's what really bothered me about the Warrior Ultimate. For the Mage Ultimate, what bothered me was the tentacles on the book. I think it's quite strange. I think I would have preferred if it was a closed book similar to the Daybreak and Gildan Song, as well as the Oathsworn Staff and Tomb. However, the weapon itself is decent, I guess. The wings, I didn't really like that they protrude outwards and were so big. It was kind of disturbing, actually. So the ultimate designs, they weren't really that great, and in fact, this is the only dungeon where I think the second best weapon, which was the legendaries, would fit way better with the Voidborn sets. So weapons, I'll probably give it like 6 out of 10. Now let's switch gears up and talk about the armors. Now the armors are, I'm just gonna put this out right now, the armors are probably not as good as the weapons in my opinion. As for the tier 1 sets, Guardian is kind of the worst of the bunch. Warrior and Mage are quite nice, although Mage has a really strong resemblance to Dracani Mage from the Gilded Skies. I think they look at least decent. Not my favorite, but they're decent. Now the Eldritch sets are probably the worst armors in my opinion. I didn't like that their face was basically all tentacles or fangs as well as some eyes. I thought it just looked kind of weird. The armor as well is not great, but it's okay. One thing that stood out to me though is Eldritch Mage armor was really close to Dracani Mage armor as well as Fallen Mage armor from Insane. When I first equipped it, it was really hard to tell the difference, and you guys might disagree again, but I think they're just too close to each other to be considered different armors. Now last up we have the Voidborn set, which is the best armor set from this dungeon. Now I'm just gonna get this out of the way right now. I don't like how the Guardian set looks for Voidborn. I don't like the shade of neon that they chose for Guardian being green. I think I would have preferred if Guardian was a blue shade instead of green. Now, it would look close to Mage apparently, but Mage I would consider more purple than being blue. So I think blue could have been tried for Guardian as well. Also, as a side note, if you compare Voidborn Guardian with the other two Guardian sets, you'll actually notice that the general color scheme is exactly the same. And that is something I would consider kind of lazy, if you ask me. Now for Mage and Warrior, I think their designs are probably one of the best in this dungeon right now. My favorite set is Voidborn Warrior. I really like the design of this armor set. Although the skull mask did make me think of Elden Bark Warrior and the general color scheme of the armor, I still think it looks pretty good actually. And it fits with the Warrior Legendary really well, believe it or not. Now for the Mage set, I think it is good, although it is not nearly as good as the Warrior set in my opinion. For some reason, Mage just did not really stick out to me, as well as giving off Elden Bark Mage vibes to me. Even though it had 3 eyes, for some reason the black behind it and just a general look of a hood with a crown, that made me really think of Elden Bark Mage for a second. So a lot of people have complained about my taste about armor sets from when I reviewed the tier 3 armor sets in Dungeon Quest. And especially with Elden Bark Mage being slightly close to Triton, at least to me. So I just want to stress, I did not say Elden Bark is a direct copy of Triton. What really made me think of Triton was just the eyes and the general shape of the helmet, if you exclude the tree barks from that. The general design of Elden Bark Mage, for some reason to me, just felt like it was similar to Triton in terms of the general shape. Of course, the colors save it from being extremely close to Triton, but I just found some similarities between Elden Bark and Triton, so that's kind of why I said it was similar. And the same thing kind of applies to Voidborn. I really thought it was very similar to Elden Bark Mage when I saw it. Again, it's kind of a hot take, and a lot of people might probably disagree with me, but this set just really felt similar to Elden Bark Mage to me. So to sum it all up, the armor sets are okay. I think my favorite sets is Voidborn Warrior, Voidborn Mage, as well as Fallen Mage. The Eldritch sets I really didn't like, and the Guardian sets as a whole for this dungeon I don't like that much. However, I still would say this Guardian set as a whole is way better than the Yokai Peak Guardian sets, because I really didn't like those. So my rating of the armor sets as a whole would probably be a 5 out of 10. Only the Voidborn and the tier 1 Mage and Warrior sets are really what I consider good. The Eldritch sets I don't like, as well as any of the Guardian sets in this dungeon, so I'm giving it a 5. So with the armor score being 5 and the weapons being a 6, the whole list of items I would give about a 5.5 out of 10. There are some designs that I just really don't like, especially the Eldritch sets and the low tier Nightmare weapons, as well as the sizing of the insane weapons. That is what I really don't like about them, as well as the ultimate weapon designs. This is surprising to probably everyone, but I prefer the legendary designs over the ultimate ones. So that's all I have to say about the items. So last up, we have the balancing of the dungeon. Now, unlike Yokai Peak and probably any other dungeon that I've talked about in the past, this is going to be a very controversial one and kind of a spicy one, because for the first time in Dungeon Quest history, Nightmare is kind of different from Insane in terms of how they play, so I'm going to be talking about each difficulty separately. So starting off with Insane, this may be an unpopular opinion, but I actually think Insane is nicely balanced. I never found Insane to be very unfair, but I never found it to be a cakewalk either. So it is definitely much better than Yokai Peak in terms of balancing, because I still think Yokai Peak is too easy. The only things that really did bother me on Insane is the Void Familiar's beam a lot of times can act as a barrier or a wall, so you are not allowed to walk straight through them. I have no clue why Voldex did this or if it was intentional at all, but it's something that really bothers me about this. Another thing that bothers me on Insane is with T. You guys might have known this already, but a lot of people have really struggled on T, including me. Now I'm at a point where I know T cycle and I can avoid it easily using the legendary spells, but if you're using Inner Focus or Inner Rage, you're really gonna have a tough time fighting T, and that is mostly due to her Blade Barrage being really stupid. Now unlike Craig's horizontal lines, they are not in random positions, but they are so close to each other that it is very difficult to avoid without taking more than one hit or so. Now, a few people have developed strategies against T using Inner, but the fact that people needed to look up how to do this is a sign that it may be a little bit too difficult. So I think a nerf for her Blade Barrage is appropriate. And if it does get nerfed, I think Insane would be a perfect difficulty. Not too easy, but not too hard. Now, Nightmare on the other hand is a complete 180 in what I think about the difficulty. Nightmare is way too hard. Now, this may surprise a lot of people, but even as a Dungeon Quest pro, I think Nightmare is way too unfair with its attacks and minion placements. Now, it's not really so much that the minion places are different. What really makes Nightmare unfair is the attack timings and their hitbox sizes are all different. And it's at a point where you cannot beat it without any deaths, or even without the legendary spells you get. It just was not possible, at least for me. Now, this may raise concern about how I was able to beat Nightmare Duo without the legendary spell. And in fact, only my teammate had the legendary spell because I was just really unlucky and insane. Other than that first purple helmet and the purple armor that I was able to get, I wasn't very lucky and insane. Now, I have developed a strategy which made me able to beat Nightmare, and we just kind of adapted to the difficulty, so we knew which places we had to be more careful with, and just a general strategy to kill the minions. Just one person aggro and the other person uses the legendary spells just to pull the mobs away so they never attack. That is the general strategy we had to use, and this I would consider a cheese. Now, surprisingly, that's really the only thing that I would consider unfair about Nightmare. The HP jump wasn't even that much higher compared to all the other dungeons, but the attack timings and their hitbox size changes are just what really killed the difficulty for me. Take this for an example. If we take the Exalted Queen's Guard, which is the first boss on Abyssal Void, and compare that to its insane variant, it's like night and day. Say those fireball RNG circles that appear on the ground that the boss does every once in a while. The hitbox size on Insane was so small that it basically didn't matter that much unless you got it extremely unlucky. Nightmare, however, they are basically twice as big, and they inflict you with anti-healing, which is a big problem for me. And it's not even just that, the general width of the rectangle that the boss throws at you is a lot wider, so it's just barely dodgeable with Inner. And the big melee hitbox that it does is undodgeable without the legendary spells, unless you know it is coming. So that side of the balancing is really bad for me. So I would like to see Nightmare to be changed so the attack timings and hitboxes at least match those with Insane. And then I would consider Nightmare even a remotely fair fight, because it was balanced based on the legendary spells, which was understandable. But for those unlucky people who couldn't get them, you're going to need those before you can go to Nightmare. Now let's talk about the spells. It was really cool that Volux added so many spells, and they're also trying out some new features with these spells, which I thought were really cool. So we got 4 Guardian spells in this dungeon overall. That's right, we got 4 Guardian spells, which is surprising because Guardian was considered a really bad class and just a supporting class as a whole. Now, it is still technically a supporting class, but now we have abilities that allows Guardians to be even more useful than just a healer. In fact, there is one Guardian spell that allows you to deal damage to mobs. Now, the charge up spells from Mage and Warrior I thought were nice. It wasn't as difficult to move around in a clockwise pattern like many other people describe, but it's still maybe a little difficult, especially for mobile and Xbox players. But I think PC players have the biggest disadvantage to that spell because a lot of people will probably have a hard time moving left or right depending on what spell they're using. That's the only thing that really concerns me about the charge up. Another spell that I really didn't like was Void Flames, which is the insane mage spell. If you've seen in my Nightmare duo run, you'll probably know that sometimes the visual just doesn't like to appear. And if you use it a lot of times and the visual just doesn't appear, your game may freeze from all the effects it has to play because it didn't render them the first time. That's the only thing I don't like about Void Flames. In terms of its general balancing, I think it's okay. So to sum up the balancing, Insane I think is good, but T needs a nerf on that. Nightmare, in my opinion, needs a nerf, so the attack timings and hitbox sizes should match those of Insane. The different minion places I think are fine, but it's just that their attacks are just too unfair to dodge. The spells I also think are good, and they're way better than the Yokai Peak spells. So balancing overall, I would give it about a 7 out of 10. If it was not for Nightmare being so unfair, I would put this at a 9 out of 10. But because the Nightmare was balanced based on the legendary spells, I have to deduct points off that. So I guess that's all we have to talk about for Abyssal Void. Nothing really else to say. So if we sum up all of our scores from the map design and theming, the item designs, and the balancing of the dungeon, we get an overall average of a 7 out of 10. I think this dungeon is a huge step up from Yokai Peak, and it's definitely leagues better than that dungeon. I would even go as far to say as this dungeon is about as good as Gilded Skies as a whole, which is ironic saying that this is a Void version of Gilded Skies. However, what kills me about the dungeon is the item designs, especially for armors, and the balancing on Nightmare. That is really what kills me about this dungeon from stopping it from being any higher. So I guess that's all I have to say about this dungeon, and that's gonna be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this review of Abyssal Void, and I hope you continue enjoying this dungeon. I will still be making some challenges in the coming days, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.